Hey everyone, this is a quick video on Asset Total Cost of Ownership, or TCO. This was introduced in the Hardware Asset Management Pro and the Enterprise Asset Management Pro products in the Vancouver release. So it's now been out for a couple of releases because we're currently on the Washington version at the time that this video is posted. So one of the primary tasks of an asset management practitioner is to equip stakeholders within the company with meaningful data. And one of the areas where practitioners have fallen short over time, simply because they didn't have access to the data, was to equip their sourcing or vendor management or supplier management counterparts with the total cost of owning an asset throughout its life cycle, right? More often than not, when folks in sourcing or supplier or vendor management go to renegotiate that Dell storage contract or that Lenovo or IBM end user device contract, they're looking at it purely from a unit cost perspective. So how much am I paying per unit of 5,000, 10,000, 20,000 assets for my organization's refresh relative to what I paid for it at the last contract event, right? Typically, that's what they're looking at. Sometimes they're going to look at other attributes like services, professional services, and warranties, and what sort of accessories am I going to get with that, consumables and monitors and so on. But as the iceberg analogy tells us, that certain things that are at the tip of the iceberg are all the things that you really look at, with things under the surface really brewing up a storm. And when it comes to IT assets, those elements that are brewing up a storm could be anything and everything that happens to that asset from after the time it's come into the organization. So assets are going to go through incidents over time. Eventually, those incidents are going to become problematic, which is why they end up becoming problem tickets. There's going to be changes happening to assets within the organization. You might have to make some memory upgrades to them over the time of the refresh cycle. There's going to be other activities if you've got assets that are designated to be loaned out to individuals on a temporary basis every time they go out and come back in. That takes someone's time to get a ticket or a task, go out, pick up the asset, bring it back, re-image it, and then put it back on the shelf for the next person to pick up. Users are going to leave the organization and new employees are going to come in. So there's all sorts of events, life cycle events, that are going to take place for an asset over its life cycle. And with each of those events, you're going to have people doing work on the asset or associated to the asset. So there's labor involved, there's time and material involved. There's going to be unit of measure for operational productivity that will be gained or lost during that time. So how do you make sure that you capture all of those costs and factor them into the TCO calculation? Well, because all of the work on your platform actually happens with ServiceNow, ServiceNow is the platform for IT. That's where you log your tickets. That's where you capture your incidents. That's where work gets streamlined across the organization. Because we already have that data, it's a simple fact of surfacing that back and contextualizing it for the hardware asset management practitioner. So for that reason, what we introduced in, as I mentioned, the Vancouver release of the product is this whole concept of asset TCO. So one of the things that we've always had on the platform, if you go into the asset estate module of the hardware asset management workspace within the hardware asset management application, we surface back very simple information over time about the frequency of incidents that have been logged by your ITSM team against certain types of assets. So now you can see very quickly which assets have had a very high frequency of work done against them. So this isn't anything new. This is something we've been able to report back from the incident management table and service it back to the hardware asset management practitioner. But if you think of a specific asset having more than just incidents done on it, you may have a contractual event, you may have an offboarding, a loan, right? All those other activities I talked about, we can actually track them and relate them back to the hardware within the lifecycle view. So I'm going to go into the hardware assets tab, and we're actually going to pull up a specific asset tag that's actually got a significant amount of work done against it over time. So I'm going to pull up this asset tag, and here it is. We're going to open up that. It's a storage device. And as we look at this asset, obviously there's some attributes about the asset right here on the left, But if you see on the right, we actually capture events that have occurred throughout the life cycle of this asset. If this asset was requested through a request mechanism, we'll capture that. If this asset was RMA'd to a vendor for some sort of work offsite, that would have been captured. And as you can see, all the incidents against the asset have also been logged. So every time an incident is logged against an asset, if you think about the work that's done on those incidents, there's going to be a start timer and an end timer when that work finishes. And we can capture all of that within ServiceNow's incident management capabilities. But now what you can configure in the tool is that every time work is done on an asset, again, be it an incident, be it a change, be it a request, be it any type of event, we can log expense lines for that work, right? So an expense line could be anything from when the asset was purchased, so that's your initial purchase cost or the tip of the iceberg, all the way down to recurring costs for maintenance, all the way to contractual renewal events, right? So if you go through a renewal event for a contract, someone's actually going to be investigating those assets that are part of a contract. So there's someone's time and material and labor that's gone into that work effort. So we're able to capture all of those costs as running expense lines. And once we capture all of those, we've actually created a TCO workspace widget for practitioners to go in and compare the total cost of ownership for certain models against benchmarks that you can define and set in the platform. And then you can look at seeing which one of these models have either approached that benchmark or have exceeded that benchmark. So now you may have to make some decisions around changing your hardware model standards. For example, if something's costing you more than it should, more than a benchmark that you've set, how do you make sure that you make that or equip your sourcing or supplier management teams with those sorts of analytics to make that decision and renegotiate more competitive arrangements with your suppliers, or to relook at other suppliers or other models within the existing supplier. So in this case, if I had a certain, a Lenovo Blade Center, which has a benchmark that's, it's not quite approached the level that you've set in the threshold, but it's still pretty high. You can actually go in and you can see all of the assets that are approaching that sort of quote unquote high level of TCO. If you can see here, we had the storage device that we were looking at earlier. If I go in here, now I can actually see all of the storage devices that are approaching that benchmark. So let's say I opened up this specific one, which is costing me a certain dollar value, which again, we can report back through those expense lines. I can now see this specific storage device, has over 1,100 expense lines that will span, various events. So yeah, hopefully this gives you a sneak peek. This is meant to be a short video on giving visibility to asset practitioners around the total cost of owning their assets over time, setting benchmarks so that when you hit those thresholds, you are notified and that you can equip your sourcing and vendor management counterparts and stakeholders within the organization about pivoting on decisions around setting hardware standards into your contract renewal events. Thanks for watching.